My name is Ejad,
And my name is Jambo.
and today we will be talking about the recently ongoing Ukraine peace talks.
Okay, let's get started. First, we'll talk about the historical background regarding the war. To begin with, we have to talk about the Maidan Revolution. The Maidan Revolution was a wave of demonstration and civil unrest in Ukraine, which began on 21st November 2013, with large protests in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. The protest was sparked by President Viktor's sudden decision not to sign the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement, which is a major step of pro-Western stance. The ensuing revolution ousted the former president. On 25th February, the police abandoned central Kyiv that afternoon as the protesters took control. The president fled the city that evening. The next day, on 22nd February, Ukrainian parliament voted to remove the former president, which marks the revolution. Pro-Russian counter-revolutionary protests also erupted in southern and eastern Ukraine. Days after the ouster of the president, Russia occupied and then annexed Crimea, dismissing the government. A referendum was held under Russian occupation, and according to the Russian installed authorities, the result was overwhelmingly in favor of joining Russia, so Ukraine lost its first territory in the conflict. Months later, in April 2014, Russian-blocked militants seized towns and cities in Ukraine's East Donbas region and proclaimed the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic as independent states, starting the Donbas War. In fear of further escalation, the Minsk Agreement, a series of international agreements which sought to end the Donbas War fought between armed Russian separatist groups and armed forces of Ukraine, were signed. However, reportedly, the ceasefire was not well abided. The Minsk Agreement led to the development of Steiner's formula, which calls for the elections to be held in the separatist territories under the Ukrainian legislation and the supervision of the OSCE to determine which country to join. This formula was named after the German president. On 22nd February 2022, which is a long time after, Russia President Vladimir Putin declared that the Minsk Agreement no longer existed, and that Ukraine, not Russia, was to blame for their collapse. Russia then launched a full invasion of Ukraine on 24th February 2022. Although Russia advanced rapidly until March 2022, almost capturing the capital, Kyiv, Ukrainian forces have pushed back, reclaiming most of the territories beside the southeast province in November. Since then, with more than 3 years of offensives and counter-offensive, Russian and Ukrainian forces are in a war of attrition and an active front line of more than 1,000 kilometers. Neither side has any realistic prospect of winning the war, although Russia is attempting to make further territory gains during a summer offensive. There has been intermittent peace talks since March 2022. However, not much substance has been achieved. After the election of Trump, which campaigned on ending the Ukraine war in 24 hours, the US became more actively involved in sorting out the war. Trump met Zelenskyy in White House on February the 28th, which turned out to be a publicity disaster. This has prompted the European leaders to meet in London in support of Ukraine. However, Ukraine did sign a deal giving US access to some of its mineral as US vows to withhold aid. Okay, so this is why the war started. And we'll elaborate further on the factors that I believe has mainly contributed to the war. So as we can see, from 2014 to 2022, Ukraine has adopted an increasingly pro-Western stance in terms of diplomacy and with this regard to foreign relations. The president, after the one that is ousted, Poroshenko, has been very pro-Western, and Zelenskyy, the president after Poroshenko, has been even more pro-Western, even calling the former president to be connected to Russia because that Zelenskyy is so much more pro-Western. And Russia during these years has seen increasing nationalistic sentiments under the authoritarian control of President Vladimir Putin, which has concentrated its power during the years. And as you can see on the PPT, I think there are 4 potential and major causes of the conflict. The most important factor is presumably the Russian desire to restore the Soviet-era sphere of influence and territory. During the beginning of the 2022 attack, Russia claimed its intention was to trigger regime change in Ukraine, also suggesting the possibility of annexing Ukraine at large. The Russian army was heading for Kyiv at the start of the offensive, rather than reinforcing the territories it has gained. With the eastward expansion of NATO and European Union, Russia has not only lost its influence on previous satellite states, but also the former Soviet republics. In the Soviet era, a portion of the Russian Republic were reorganized to the Ukrainian Republic. This became a major problem according to Russia and its president Vladimir Putin after the Soviet collapse. This was also the reason why it claimed Ukraine was never an independent country. Regaining this territory not only concerns strategic and economic interests, but is also highly symbolic of the revitalization of the Russian government. Secondly, another very important factor that I reckon is Putin's desire to shape his personal legacy and consolidate his rule. He adopted a very nationalistic stance during his first few years as president and prime minister. He claimed he wanted to make Russia great again and bring a strong and prosperous Russia. In recent years, Putin has reinforced his power and control and sphere of influence inside the government. He has essentially captured the state apparatus of Russia, becoming the supreme leader. This means that every official and decisions has to listen to Putin and has to be approved by him, making him very, very influential in the Russian government. So as a result, no matter Russia's success or fail, all of those will be attributed to Putin when he left the office or died. So he is definitely trying to shape his legacy, because the Russian economy has not been performing well or performing to the standards that the citizens has been expecting before the war. So he is trying to distract the citizens and shape his legacy through another form, that is to provoke nationalistic sentiments and increase its territory, so it can have a point to boast after maybe he left office. That's why I believe the desire to annex Ukraine mainly stem from Putin's desire to be remembered in history. A great conqueror would be the best way to make himself remembered. Additionally, the third factor that I'm mentioning here is the rising nationalistic and imperialistic sentiment in Russia. This is very connected to the second point, because I believe that the nationalistic and imperialistic sentiment in Russia was mainly provoked by Putin and his government, which he done so to conquer Ukraine and more territory in order to make him remember in the history. Because of this nationalistic and imperialistic sentiment in Russia, it also has a very anti-Western stance. So they somehow view the war on Ukraine as justified. They also believe they may also believe that ethnically Russian in Ukraine also deserves to be integrated back into the Russian territory. So this has definitely decreased the internal and domestic opposition towards the war. And lastly, of strategic concern, stopping the rapid NATO expansion and ensuring the security is also a vital point why the Russian president Vladimir Putin started the war. This was actually Putin's proclaimed goal when he was starting the war. During the end of the Cold War, the West was promised that there will be no eastward expansion of the NATO if Germany was reunified. But that promise obviously was never kept, and it was broke again. Although Ukraine joining NATO would not necessarily be an existential crisis for Russia, its ability to project its influence through military action and deterrence in the eastern bloc of Europe would be significantly harmed if Ukraine was to join NATO.
Okay. Yeah, so Jumbo gave us a very detailed overview of how the conflict came to be and also possible reasons for the conflict. And so now I'll go a little deeper into the details of the recent peace talks, which is more or less the topic or of this podcast. So so by recent, I mean the negotiations that have taken place after President Trump came into office, or at least after he won the election. So much of the negotiations in this podcast are Trump related, and this is because the U.S. stance, or what the negotiations, what the peace talks have been like, have been drastically different before Trump and after Trump. And currently, Trump is leading the negotiations, or he is playing a very influential role, and so that's what we will be discussing. So during the campaign, as many of us probably most likely remember, Trump promised to stop the war in 24 hours if elected. Now that has not happened, as with many of his other campaign promises, so that's not really surprising, but that's what he said. But one thing that should be pointed out that he has taken action. He's continuing to take action, and also immediately after his election victory, he took action. So on December the 7th, he met with French President Macron and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy in Paris at the reopening of the Notre Dame, and as you can see with in the picture here, and I think this meeting shows two things. It shows the great emphasis that Trump put at least at the time on these peace talks, and the great emphasis or the great importance of Trump in these peace talks that the Europeans put on him, because it doesn't happen that often that current world leaders meet a world leader that has not come into office yet. So I think it really does show the importance of Trump, and also the importance that Trump attached to these peace talks. So at least this was, a good sign, and it was the start of Trump's actions in his second term in these peace talks. And now we fast forward to him taking office. So 2 days after taking office, he said he would impose further sanctions and higher tariffs on Russia if Putin did not make a deal to end the war in Ukraine. He said that though he was not looking to hurt Russia and had always had a good relationship with President Putin, he would still take such action. He also said that Zelenskyy should not have allowed this war to happen, suggesting that Ukraine was partly responsible for the Russian invasion, as Jumbo mentioned before, I believe. Combined with what his defense secretary said on February the 12th during a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Center contact group at NATO headquarters, which was that restoring Ukraine's pre-2014 borders was an unrealistic objective that would only prolong the war. He also said that while Ukraine must have robust security guarantees, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. So, putting aside our ideas or our comments or our opinions on what they said, or on whether this is correct or not, the fact that we can see from the very start the Trump administration started making compromises. So he said, and his attitude was more inclined toward Russia than the previous administration, the Biden administration, also many Western allies have been. He suggested that Ukraine was partly responsible. He said that restoring borders was an unrealistic objective, or his defense secretary said that. So we can see from the very start, the Trump administration made their stance very clear, and they also lowered expectations. And I think that's a very important part, and that's really where the conversation about peace talks goes from there, right? So a few takeaways from what he did in his first month in office, and before that, after he won the election, he did not follow through on his campaign promises, which were, I think we all knew that it was practically impossible. You can't stop a war within 24 hours. He is seemingly pro-Russian, at least more pro-Russian than compared with the previous administration and many of their Western allies, and he lowered expectations from the start. Now, this was criticized by some European allies. For example, I believe the French defense minister and the German defense minister, they all criticized Trump. They said that when dealing with Putin, you get peace through strength, not peace through concessions. So I think that's a very important and very interesting part. So here we can already see that there are some differences between the Trump administration stance and that of their Western European allies. So now we will move on to the next phase in our podcast. Oh, not the next phase, but next slide. Okay, doesn't really matter. So on February the 12th, Trump held a phone call with Putin. He called it highly productive, and it was the first of many phone calls they held. Trump seems to really like calling Putin for some reason. Perhaps he likes doing that. Yeah. On the 18th, American and Russian delegations met in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, led by the U.S. was led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and the Russian delegation was led by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And so I think from what we can see here, is that the Trump administration at first tried to engage with Russia directly. They did not want to include Ukraine in the peace talks that were about Ukraine's future. So I think at this point of stage, Trump really wanted to get something done because he said that he would get it done in 24 hours, and it was proving to be more difficult than he expected. So he wanted to get things done by talking to, in his opinion, most likely the more important power or party in these peace talks, which was Russia. So he tried to circumvent Ukraine in peace talks about Ukraine. I don't think that's a really correct approach. The official explanation for why Rubio met with Lavrov was that Trump was trying to discern whether Russia was serious about wanting to end the war, and that the only way to find out was to test them, to basically engage with them and say, okay, are you serious about ending the war? And if so, what are your demands? Are your public demands and your private demands different? I'm quoting Secretary of State Rubio. So that was the official reason that they gave, but I think more practically, they were trying to solve the problem by talking to the more important party in their opinion, and that was Russia. So at first they tried to circumvent Ukraine, and that's not a good thing to do. Other things that happened in February 2025 are Trump also engaged with Ukraine. He said that further support would be conditional on U.S. getting revenue from Ukraine's rare minerals. Zelenskyy proposed U.S. participation in developing Ukraine's natural resources in exchange for continued U.S. support to defend against Russia. So now Trump is bargaining with Ukraine about their minerals and their rare minerals, their natural resources, and that's not something that Trump or the U.S. administration did in the past. So there is really a large difference from the previous administration and what the Trump administration has been doing up till now. There were reports that said that the Trump administration asked for half of Ukraine's mineral and oil resources. Now, obviously, Zelenskyy rejected that because the U.S. asked for so much, but they did not even give Ukraine's clear security guarantees, right? And Trump also demanded that that Ukraine pay the U.S. 500 billion U.S. dollars in compensation for U.S. support during the war, even though the U.S. only supplied Ukraine with 182 billion dollars. So we can see from here that Trump is trying to negotiate with Ukraine, and that's different from what the previous administration did or what other Western allies are doing. The other Western allies are putting the war first, are putting Ukraine's security and its survival first. They are first giving aid, and then after, perhaps in the future, if Ukraine survives, then we can talk about compensation. Here, Trump is basically forcing Ukraine's hand, saying that we will only continue to support you if you give us certain benefits. So this is a very different type of negotiation and a very different type of support. And I honestly think it's also the Trump style of support. He truly does want to get something for his help. Later on in this PPT, Trump looks out for one thing and one thing only, his interests, and also an extension to those of the US, but mostly his interests. And when everything else, whether it's allies, whether it's traditional alliances, they all pale in comparison. So that's Trump.
Okay, so I actually do have a question here. So do you think like Russia is actually like seeking out for peace, whether it's like actively or passively?
Yeah, I don't really think Russia is actually seeking peace. They are, as I will mention later on in the podcast, I think they are at least ostensibly complying with Trump, and they are complying with his deadlines. They are seemingly doing things right, as we will discuss later on. The Alaska conference, they are engaging in diplomacy, but I do not think they truly want peace at heart. It is perhaps a ploy to delay time, to give them more time on the battleground. So I don't really think they have peace at heart. It's not in their interests. I don't really think it's in their interest at this point.
Yeah, I also don't think like Russia will like actively seek out peace unless like the treaty was like giving all of the occupied
Yeah,
territory and having no or like very ineffective security guarantees for Ukraine,
yeah.
which would definitely not happen, or at least like Ukraine would not agree to it.
Yeah. So I think there are only really two situations in which Russia would agree. It's one where they're given a lot, they are satisfied with what they have gotten from this war, and the other is when it is shown to them that it is more costly to continue than it is to stop. Um, but I think both are rather unlikely at this point. So yeah, I don't really think peace is going to happen in the near future, which is something we will discuss later on.
Yeah.
And I also don't think that they really have peace at heart because they also know it's very difficult. What they want is unlikely to be fulfilled by Ukraine, by the West, by the United States even. But if you do you have anything else to add, or I'll continue?
Yeah, I think like probably like giving like Russia full integration into the global economy might help, but I'm also not very like sure whether Ukraine will allow that to happen because Ukraine certainly want Russia undermined and weakened, not
Yes.
that Russia fully integrated. Even though like Russia might want to like maintain good relationship with the West, there is also like the threat and the potential like for Russia to invade Ukraine in the future.
Yes, yes. I think Ukraine certainly does not want Russia to gain from this invasion. So yeah, I'll continue.
Yeah.
So in late February, Trump said that Ukraine should have new presidential elections, and he called President Zelenskyy a dictator. Uh, Zelenskyy replied by saying that Trump was living in a Russian disinformation bubble, and so we can see from here that the U.S.-Ukraine relationships were deteriorating. And but at the same time, European leaders stood by Ukraine's side. Both President Macron of France and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that Zelensky was Ukraine's democratically elected leader, which was completely the opposite of Vladimir Putin. So we can see that at this point, U.S.-Ukraine relationships are already deteriorating, and they will ultimately culminate in the fateful meeting on February the 28th, I believe, between Zelensky and President Trump in the White House. But at this point, we can see that while it has been deteriorating the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine, Europe has stood resolutely with Ukraine. And I think there are a few reasons for this, and we'll discuss them later on. But now we'll continue. So on February the 24th and 27th, which is really just 7, 8 days after Trump came into office, right? Oh no, he came into office in January. Okay,
Yeah.
that's more than a month. Okay, my bad. So it's more than a month after he came into office. On the 24th and 27th of February, Macron and Starmer they visited Trump in the White House. Now they called for peace and security agreements, and it was likely to set the stage for the Trump-Zelensky meeting on the 28th, which turned into a great disaster, as I'm sure many of us here know very well. It was really the I think the really um, the worst Oval Office meeting the world has ever seen. Very, very seldom does an Oval Office meeting between two heads of state turn into a shouting match, and that's exactly what it did. But I think Trump sent a clear message here, right? He sent the message that Ukraine needs the United States, and the United States can treat Ukraine in whichever manner they would like. And so they tried to send a strong message. And on March the 2nd, Zelensky said on TV that the relationship between the US and Ukraine can be restored. Uh, After getting shouted at in the Oval Office in front of the world, he says this a few days later. And I think it truly does show the very difficult situation that Ukraine is and the great leverage that the United States holds. And after this shouting match, Zelensky said that he was ready to sign the U.S.-Ukraine minerals agreement, which is a concession. And I guess you could say that Trump actually did gain from that shouting match. And I think as we have seen, whether in these peace talks or in the past, I think Trump does use this method of coercion, and he does get results. So it's the Trump method. It's not morally applaudable, but it certainly does get results. I do think so. While these relationships deteriorated, Europe still once again has shown its staunch support for Ukraine. On March the 2nd, the London summit on Ukraine was convened in London. Many world leaders from Europe and also Canada, Japan, Ukraine, they all came, and they expressed their great support for Ukraine, and they created the coalition of the willing, excuse me, coalition of the willing to defend Ukraine. After the unsuccessful meeting on February the 28th, the fact that Ukraine's allies in Europe and also around the world were able to show their support, I think was very important. And on March the 3rd, I think U.S.-Ukraine relations really hit a rock bottom where the United States suspended all military aid to Ukraine. It didn't really continue long, but it suspended it for at least a few weeks, I believe. But then on March the 4th, Trump addressed Zelensky with a more conciliatory message in Congress, and he mentioned that Zelensky was ready to sign a minerals deal. So why Trump all of a sudden seemed to like Zelensky a little bit more is up to discussion. I personally think it's one, he saw that he saw that his allies and many Western allies were still standing with Ukraine, and he doesn't want to be on terrible terms with all of them. Secondly, he got what he wanted. Um, Zelensky was ready to sign the minerals deal. And third, I honestly don't think Trump wanted the meeting on the 28th to degenerate into what it eventually did. It just kind of went out of hand. Um, I really don't think Trump wanted it, but it happened, and now Trump was trying to perhaps make some recovery to the relationship to try to somehow salvage the relationship ever so slightly. Because also I think the general American public, I think they still support Ukraine in their fight against Russia, though I'm not sure. I don't really have stats to back that claim up. So anyway, a few takeaways from this part is one, in Chinese we say 弱国无外交. It's rather cliche, but it basically means that weak countries have no diplomacy. I think it shows very clearly here. Um, Zelensky and Ukraine, I would say this quite bluntly, they're kind of at the they're kind of at the mercy of Trump especially.
Yeah.
And also right now they are relying on Europe's support. If did not convene the London summit a few days later, I honestly think that Ukraine would have been in a very poor situation. So really, weak countries, we talk about international order, we talk about international law. Weak countries, if they don't have the support of stronger entities or stronger organizations, I don't think they have much chance at diplomacy. So this old adage of 弱国无外交 it really does stand today. The second thing is Trump changes often. Trump on the 28th, Trump was saying very, 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 very mean things about Zelensky, and on the 4th of March, he was saying rather conciliatory things about Zelensky. So Trump changes often. His views, his viewpoints, his opinions, they change often. But one thing endures, and that's his pursuit of his interests. That's something I touched upon previously, and that's something I will continue to say. I do think that I don't agree with many of Trump's negotiating methods, but they do show results, and that's I guess that's what negotiation ultimately wants to achieve. Right, and the third thing is that throughout this process, Europe has stood resolutely with Ukraine, and I think that's truly applaudable.
Yeah, I think I do have something to add upon a few takeaways. The first is that like 弱国无外交 I've said. If we compare Ukraine with Iran, which was also struck by Israel like earlier this year, can we because Ukraine has definitely support more like military and foreign aid from those democratic and Western countries during the whole process of war, and I think both like Russian and like Israeli aggression were not abiding with like the international law very much, but we still see that Ukrainian, when compared to Iran, they still receive like massive support in terms of no matter like militarily or like financially. So I think that somehow points that like if you are like representing something that the major powers were willing to preserve an ideology similar to that, maybe you still have some support and have some say in the like international affairs. Although it is very like obvious that in these months, like Zelensky was clearly at the mercy of Trump. Like Trump can treat Zelensky however it's want.
Yeah. So it's possible, but your point is obviously very valid. But a small thing I would like to say is that what I meant was that they are reliant on, for example, in this case, their European allies for diplomacy. Without their European allies, they would not be able to, no matter how just the cause is, without their allies, they would not be able to do much.
Yeah, I see. And
Yeah.
I also want to actually like add up to like the second point. Like I think that Trump's like way of like behaving and his way of like doing diplomacy do you like a short-term benefit from the United States, such as like the trade deals he received from like European Union, China, India, and Japan, all those sort of countries. But also do you think that like this is ultimately like detrimental to the United States in the long
Yes.
term once he like used up all of like the American soft power like in a very short time? Like American will be like the decline. We will see a decline of like American influence once Trump has used all of the leverage. Like
Yeah.
future like leaders will perhaps have nothing to use, or like have less things to use. Although we are expecting to see like more multipolar like settings in the role, like European Union or China like maybe taking the lead and exerting more influence, but to be honest, like until now, I don't think like European Union has or China has basically like take a huge responsibility, except like European Union on the case of Ukraine right now.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's very complicated. Yeah, I think Trump's second term has shown us how important a stable United States is. Like in the past, we took it for granted, but now we know how important it is that the United States has a very stable, I would say more traditional leader. I will put it that way. So now we'll continue.
Yeah, sure.
So I think here, the relationship really hit a rock bottom between the United States and and Ukraine. After this, I think it's there's after all, there's really no way to go down from what happened in the past, and the relationships seem to warm a bit, and I think much of it is connected with the fact that Ukraine did agree to sign the minerals agreement, and Trump got what he wanted, right? So naturally, or not naturally, but consequently, the relations warmed. On March 11th, Ukraine and U.S. and Ukrainian officials met in Jeddah, which is also in Saudi Arabia. And last time it was Russia and in the U.S. Now it's Ukraine and the U.S. So I think some turn is shown here. Ukraine accepted the U.S. proposal for a 30-day ceasefire here. Uh, and as part of the agreement, the Trump administration resumed all military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. So now their relationship is seemingly back to normal again. Rubio also said that the peace agreement was now relied on Russia. The ball is in Russia's court. So here it seems that for some reason, U.S. is now closer to Ukraine in this trade agreement, I think, in this peace deal. So I think there are a few reasons for this. Firstly, they got the deal they wanted, the rare minerals deal. Secondly, I think they also felt some pressure from their allies and also from the general American public. And also, thirdly, Trump realized that in the first phase, after coming into office, he tried to appease Putin. He tried to get it done with the Russians. He found that the Russians weren't willing to really do business. So now he turned to Ukraine, and now perhaps he's going to put some more pressure on Russia. So he found that his original method didn't work, and now he's turning to another method. On April the 24th, he criticized Russia's missile attack and drone attack on Putin on Kyiv, and asked Putin to stop the war on social media, which is something that he had not done in his term yet. So I think it also shows that he is gradually turning toward Ukraine and straying away slightly from the from Russia. And then on the 26th, Trump and Zelenskyy met in the Vatican at Pope Leo's inauguration. I don't know if it's called inauguration, but anyway, they met at the Vatican, and they talked for the first time since their meeting in February, which obviously did not go very well. And then on May the 25th, Russia and Ukrainian delegations held direct talks for the first time since early 2022 in Ankara, which shows that at least results were happening, at least improvements were being made in the peace deal. So a few takeaways from this as well. Firstly, Trump seems to have turned toward Ukraine after the shouting match in the Oval Office. And secondly, for all the criticisms I have of his style, Trump, it seems that he can get things done, right? Russian and Ukrainian delegations met for the first time since really the start of the early stages of the war. That's truly progress. And yeah, so that's basically the timeline so far. I also like to I'd also like to discuss very briefly the the so-called U.S. ultimate peace proposal, because I think it's rather ludicrous. Under its terms, the United States would offer de jure recognition of Russian control of Crimea and de facto recognition of Russian control of Luhansk, and also Russian-controlled other parts of Ukraine's territory. So basically, they would be giving Ukraine's territory to Russia. They would, on the other hand, they would be giving Ukraine security guarantees and also removing sanctions on Russia. So from here we can see it's rather pro-Russian. But then I think the most ludicrous part is the last part, which says that the U.S. would operate the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and use it to provide energy to both Russia and Ukraine. I honestly think this peace deal makes no sense because nobody would ever agree to it. Ukraine would not allow Russia to take its land. Russia would not allow Ukraine to receive security guarantees, and neither of them would allow Ukraine's nuclear power plant to be operated by the United States. So, frankly, it makes very little sense, this peace proposal, and I honestly don't know why they actually came up with this. It makes no sense. It would never work in reality.
I think maybe like Trump is trying to strike a like exact compromise, like achieving half of like Ukrainian demand and half of the Russian demand. And maybe he is trying to like create some sort of buffer zone between the two countries, but I'm not really sure about it, to be honest.
I think what's central to this proposal is the last sentence, which says that he wants the nuclear power plant.
Don't actually like understand why he wants to do that.
I think it would certainly give him much leverage over both Russia and Ukraine. He has control of a nuclear power plant on their land. That's
Yeah,
a
that's true.
yeah. But we'll continue and we'll make a few brief conclusions about this timeline, these peace talks, and some key takeaways. So the first key takeaway is that his stance changes often, but he always pursues his interests. And I think it's it's easy to criticize his methods, but he does get results, and I don't really know how you can what we should say about that. As for why, um, I think yeah, we talked about that briefly. So I'd like to talk about how his stance changed. So at first he cozied up to Putin. He thought he could get a deal and also put pressure on Ukraine, but then Putin didn't deliver, and he got what he wanted from Ukraine, which is rare minerals. And also, allies and the American public put pressure on him, so he started putting pressure on Putin to get things done. I think one thing that I did not mention previously that is that Trump is I did not elaborate much on Trump's personal interests. So Trump's personal interests in this are that I think, as was the case in the Israel-Iran conflict, he does want to be seen as a peacemaker and to project a strong yet peace-loving image on the global stage. Also, a very funny argument that could be made here is also that he wants to get into heaven. A few days ago, I saw a brief clip that said, a brief audio clip which said that Trump was worried about getting into heaven because he thought that because he said that he was at the very bottom of the list, and that if he got this done, if he got this peace deal done, perhaps he'd get to go to heaven. So I don't know if this is really a reason that's been pushing this, but if it is, then it is. Right. The second thing is Europe and other allies stand with Ukraine, and I'd like to elaborate on this quite a bit. So I'd like to explain why Europe and other allies are standing with Ukraine. So I think the first reason is justice. I think Ukraine is certainly the more just side in this conflict. The second reason is security of not only Ukraine but also Europe, continental Europe, and also I think the world as a whole. Right. For Ukraine, it's obviously of great importance. It's also very important for Europe, right? Because if Ukraine falls, then Europe is at danger. Europe is also in a very perilous situation. Also, for the world at large, if invasions still work in the 21st century, then I don't think that's very good for the global order. I don't think that's very good for the rules-based international order, and I don't think that's very good for peace and security globally. So, security is certainly, I think, a very core issue here. And the third reason is that I think Europe also wants to show that it still has the capability in the world to have great influence on matters of great importance. And because if they are unable to, influence what is going on in their own backyard and on their own continent without the support of the United States, then honestly, then that would be rather catastrophic for Europe. Um, Also, they also want to show that they are united and independent, right? They don't have to play the U.S. line. They also have their own personal goals, and they also work toward them, and they have the ability to realize them. And I think that's what they're trying to show with by standing with Ukraine. And one last thing is that I don't think the Europeans and the Canadians and really much of the world is very happy with the new Trump administration because I think they're honestly rather fed up with all the sanctions that have been going on, the trade war. and they aren't that satisfied and that happy with what Trump has been doing, and so that makes it even more important that they show that they are independent and that they do things that are right in comparison with Trump's rather business-like treatment of of these negotiations. The third thing is that we countries have no diplomacy. We talked about that later. And last but not least, I think a very important piece of information for our discussion or for peace talks is to know what's happening on the ground. And the situation currently on the ground, the generally acknowledged situation is that Russia is making slow but painful gains. So they are still inching forward on the battlefield. Yeah, last but not least, I also want to say one final thing about 弱国外交, which I mentioned previously before very briefly, and that's Ukraine really needs Europe to stick with it, because if Europe gives up on Ukraine, or if its support lessens even a bit, I think Ukraine will be in a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, I actually do want to add up to like the second point, like why Europe is more like pro-Ukraine than the US. I think like Europe is basically like just more left-leaning or like pro-liberalism than the US. Yes, because I think I have been to like US this summer and I don't actually remember seeing any like pro-Ukraine paintings or like graffitis or protests on the street, which was quite weird because I've seen a lot of like pro-Palestine stuff. And in terms of Europe, I've seen some pictures and from the internet and from my friend, and they're still like in support of the Ukraine. And I also think like the US like public is also quite like fed up and occupied with like Donald Trump and all those stuff and domestically what he is doing. So basically, I don't think that there's much of a public support for Ukraine in the US compared to Europe. And I actually think that also might be the case even before Trump took office. I'm not very sure, but I think although like US has give more money to the Ukraine in the Biden administration, but Europe has definitely been the staunchest ally of Ukraine, even before Trump took office.
Yeah, I think there was I think there was a decent amount of support for Ukraine in the United States at the very start of the war, but I think yeah, as the war has gone on, the support has dwindled because it's really been going on for too long, and also the new administration isn't that supportive, and I think that's certainly a problem that Ukraine faces, that it's faced with, because um, the support of their allies, it can always dwindle over time, and it most likely will dwindle over time, and that's not very good for them. I think, yeah, as for Europe, I think one core reason, a very important reason, is that quite simply, Ukraine is also part of Europe. It's closer to them. They understand what will happen if things go poorly in Ukraine. While for the United States, well, they are an Atlantic away, so it's not that immediate, the repercussions.
Yeah. I think like Europeans are like phrasing it as Russia as Hitler and like Ukraine as Czechoslovakia and those sort of stuff. And I do think like Americans are also quite like afraid of like based on what happened in Afghanistan and what happened in Iraq. I think they're just fed up with like foreign intervention in wars in general. So
Yeah, I think the US should care, but they're not caring much, and they also have their reasons for that.
yes.
And I think that should be about it for today. We can continue our discussions on the Alaska summit and also other very important summits in the future.
Okay, sure.